Today we have Jeremy Snyder with us. Thanks for coming in. Maybe you can start by doing a quick intro.
Yeah, happy to. So I'm Jeremy. I've been around for a little while, as evidenced by my Windows 3.5, Windows NT 3.5 breach story that some of you might have heard a little bit. But look, I started my career in IT in like 1998. I was hands-on keyboard IT and security practitioner for the first 13-ish years of my career, for a couple of I say SaaS company. They were a software company for the first 4 years, and then we became a SaaS company in the early 2000s when SaaS was kind of becoming a thing. So I ran data centers, ran cyber ops at data centers around the world for for about 13-ish years all in around that time period. Then went to work for a little startup called AWS in 2010. You might have heard of it. I hear they've gone on to do some things. Left AWS, went to a couple other startups along the way. The last 10-ish years, I've been very heavily focused on cloud security and related topics. I joined an early cloud security posture management company called DivvyCloud in 2016. We grew about 20x in a 4-year period before getting acquired by Rapid7 2 months into lockdown. Went through a little bit of I won't call it like a midlife crisis, but I definitely, like during COVID, had a little bit of a gut check of like, do I want to stay in cybersecurity? Obviously ended up deciding yes, and I'm happy to talk more about that if anybody's interested in kind of like what led me to that decision, because I think it's a valid question that a lot of people in cyber have. You all know it's a thankless job many days. Um, but in any event, left Rapid7 in late 2021, started a company called FireTail. We've been around for about 3.5 years now. We provide API security software. That was the first thing that we built. And over the last 6, 7 months, we realized that in working with our customers, that all of their AI adoption is happening over APIs. And we thought we might be able to do something interesting for them there. And turns out we put something, I think, kind of compelling together. And yeah, that's a little bit about me. I guess, like, other than that, I have lived in 5 countries. I speak 5 languages. Happy to take any questions.
Which ones?
Countries or languages?
Either or both?
Okay, so I've lived in the US. I've lived in Missouri, Indiana, California, North Carolina, Virginia. Outside the US, I have lived in Finland, France, Germany, and Singapore.
Nice. And
And
the
then
related
languages.
languages.
Yeah, English and Finnish. I'm bilingual English Finnish, dual citizen of the 2 countries, family background from Finland. Um, French, Spanish, and Portuguese would be in order, rough order. Maybe Spanish ahead of French by now, the next three, and then I'd get by in like 3 or 4 other languages beyond those. But those would be like my top five.
Nice,
Yeah,
nice, nice. Good stuff.
yeah,
Cool. I'm kind of curious to maybe to get like the ball rolling um, about the API security side of things. Like I
yeah,
feel like there's a lot of talks around the AI security,
for sure.
you kind of implied that your work kind of dovetailed into it.
Yeah,
But I'm curious to hear about like how does API security even work? Like obviously I think most people here understand API, understand security, but
sure,
it's like how
sure.
do you productionize that, I guess?
Yeah, so there's a lot of different ways of looking at securing things like APIs. And I think like this is generally true, not just for APIs. But if you think about like applications, I'd say this is very true as well. Um, you can look at 2 sides of it. You can look at kind of a proactive side of it, where you're more on like a shift left kind of approach. And I'll talk about that in a second. Or you can be more on the reactive side, or you can try to tackle one specific aspect of it, right? And so if you think about an API, for instance, there's a challenge. We wrote a whole blog post about like the problem with APIs. I think that's the name of the blog post. The problem with APIs is the following. They're an application, so they have code, right? Authentication and authorization are where the vast majority of the problems with APIs happen. So they have these strong identity related concepts that you have to get right. But they sit on a network, so they have network traffic around them, right? And so you take all these things into account and you kind of have to pick how you want to try to tackle the problem. I can't speak to like every single aspect of it. I can tell you the things that we realized as we started working on it. Number one is, if you're curious, Look at the very bottom of our website in the footer, and you'll find something called the API Data Breach Tracker. We correlated all the data that we could find of all the publicly disclosed and a few privately, like non-publicly disclosed API breaches that we know about. And we break them down as far as like what's gone wrong in each of those scenarios. And time and again, what we find is that the culprit, which is to say like what's wrong with the API, it's always something in the application code. It is never like, oh, you didn't have a WAF in place and that's why your API got breached. No, it's always some developer made some mistake, whether lazy, sloppy, or just, a bug that they didn't realize that left the API vulnerable to data scraping. That is like 99% plus of the incidents. And if you're really curious, I can even break it down to the most specific toxic combination, which on its own is more than 80% of the breaches. And that is sequential integer numbering coupled with a lack of server-side authorization. You take those two things together, and if you fix those two things about your APIs, you reduce the vulnerability of your API by like a huge percentage. So what we've done at Firetail is we've tried to combine all of the things that we can learn about an API quickly and easily by not having you install like some crazy agent on every like endpoint where you're running APIs, but by like scanning the code, reading your API spec files, looking at the configuration of the cloud environment where your API runs. You combine those three factors and you can very quickly get a sense of like what's wrong with your API and what kinds of attacks is your API potentially vulnerable to. That's a bit how we've approached the problem.
Got it. So you're thinking about this a lot more like an almost an AppSec approach to it
Yeah, I
versus.
think that's fair. Yeah.
Right. Do you think like I feel like I vaguely heard over the years various mostly I'm thinking I don't know if that's the term, but like supply side capabilities. You mentioned like a WAF that are kind of very API specific. They're like, hey, it's a proxy you put in front of the API. So in my mind, that's like supply side. Demand side would be, I guess, in the client. If somehow
I,
you can
I
control the
think
clients that hit them. But is
d
there a value there too, or?
there is, but it's a different value. And so like the supply side, so let's think of it more as let's say like design versus utilization. Okay, I think that's maybe a way to kind of think about it, right? We think a lot about the design aspect of it. We support some utilization workloads as well, which I'll come to in just a second. And I think that'll hopefully go to Leonard's question as well. So the design is really all those aspects that I mentioned, right? It's like, is your API well written? Is it deployed in an environment that is well configured? Do you have, let's say, like the good configurations in place, et cetera? The the consumption side, the demand side of it, or like the utilization side of it, what that tells you is which of my APIs are targeted, which of my APIs are attackers interested in. We have a customer that we work with, for instance, that they run a website that's a two-sided marketplace. They have creators of content and then they have consumers of content, right? And it turns out that the creators, the only APIs that attackers are interested in are the creators' APIs, because that's where the attackers can get in and get into the flow of money, right? The creators are people getting payouts. So they're the like all the APIs related to creator accounts are the ones that are interested. So the utilization and let's say like the network logs and the traffic logs, that gets you that visibility. That'll show you, for instance, which kind of attacks they're going to use. Are they looking at business logic attacks? Are they trying to just do SQL injection? Are they trying to deploy cross-site scripting or whatever it is? And you can learn about, let's say, the geographies with the obvious like caveat that IP addresses are pretty fakeable and you've got VPNs and jump servers and blah 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 blah. But you can learn a little bit perhaps about like where the attacks are coming from. But the most interesting are the tactics that they're using and the APIs that they're interested in. That's the best. Those are the things that you learn most from that kind of demand side, if you will.
Very cool, very cool. Okay, it's okay. That paints an interesting picture. It so kind of like moving, half a step forward, like or
Yeah.
shifting, right? I don't know. Um, This your approach is very strikes me as very like deterministic, right? Like engineering appsec, like hey, I love that you called out the integers, because that
Yeah, yeah,
that validates me quite a bit.
yeah,
Big fan of UUIDs here. um
yeah,
but those they feel to me like they would be quite different than what you need when you start to look at the AI side of the API security, right? Because
yeah,
like now in AI, like it's all English, it's all language. So how does that?
yeah.
What's that transition?
No, you're 100% correct. So, in fact, the types of checks that might be most beneficial to look at are very different. You're spot on in saying that like APIs are pretty deterministic, like a little bit less so with GraphQL than with REST, by the way, because GraphQL is actually a little bit more like, REST is very much like you can do the things that the REST API allows and nothing more and nothing less, right? In fact, like certain things are required, and if you don't have those things, then nothing's going to work. But if you try to do color outside the lines of those things, it's not going to work. GraphQL takes the approach, it's basically like you can ask almost any query. It almost exposes like a SQL query kind of endpoint to the person who is issuing the query or who's using the consumer of the API. It's like, hey, we're going to expose all of our data. Just ask for it in the right way and you can have it as long as your query is valid and so on. So that's kind of straddling the line. And then to your point on the AI side, it's like, can you imagine the query that you want to type and then type that in? And then, like, in theory, that should be good. And this is, by the way, exactly what's happening with MCPs and why, like, you'll hear if you Google right now, like the S in MCP stands for security. I think you'll find like a gazillion blog posts about that. And it is actually true. Like if you make an API, if you make an MCP that kind of wraps an API, your best security control is what that API will actually allow to process. So if you put constraints on that API that the MCP kind of, let's say, extract, what's the word I'm looking for? Abstracts for you. Because I think actually an abstraction layer is probably the right way to think about an MCP in front of an API. Um, if you put something on that API that does, let's say, like response payload validation and has some rules around the response payload. That's a security approach that you can put into it. Otherwise, it becomes like somewhat challenging. You've got a thing that's an abstraction layer of an API that may be pretty non-deterministic, and you really have almost no clue what the interaction and what the interpretation, how that might actually fire. It's a real open question. Um, it is something that we've been looking at a little bit. I will tell you, like full disclosure, we don't have a solution for it or even like a set of best practices at this point for it. Um, it's a very fast moving space, and I think there's like too much hype, but it brings about the same kind of behavior that we've seen now for the past, I don't know, 15 years. Like new shiny object that looks really appealing and brings a ton of business value. Business races to adopt, security is lagging behind, going like, hey, there's risk, there's risk, there's risk. And business is like, there's productivity gains, or my boss told me I have to, or, we're going to get outcompeted or FOMO or who knows what. Yeah, Microsoft recall, what a crazy idea. Just comment, just saw that flash past in the chat here. Anyway, but like that interaction layer between, or sorry, that interaction between the MCP abstraction layer and the API, to your point, is extremely non-deterministic. So if you want some controls on that whole communication path, the API is the place where you can put in place some stuff. The best stuff that, from my opinion, so far that you can put in place is around the response validation and maybe response controls. Maybe like you write some rules in the app logic that are like, I don't know, no matter what, never can you send back more than 10 records. Or no matter what, never can you send back the password column. Or I don't know, I'm just making up examples, but like some kind of rules around like information that should never be sent back.
So you mentioned something that I'm kind of scared about because I never thought about it. We built an MCP server like in my mind, the kind of the logical path was the one you talked about, right? Where you say,
Yeah.
I have a backend, I have a set of APIs that are my strong security boundary. I'm going to have an MCP server on the other end of that, and that way, mathematically, I know that my security boundary is maintained. Are there MCP servers out there that kind of remove that API boundary and just hook right into the backends? Because that feels extremely scary. Like, because at that point you're just trying to convince the
Yeah.
MCP that, I mean, not even, right? Like there is no
Yeah. Yeah.
security boundary at the MCP. So I
Yeah.
what would happen? Have you seen those or?
I've not. I've never seen one that wasn't an abstraction of an API because it does have to have some way to query. Uh, I'm sure somebody will come up with a thing that is like, no code MCP, and then it'll be exactly that, and it'll get some hype cycle. In fact, I'm debating going and registering no code MCP.ai right now, and let's see. I bet I could raise a lot of money very quickly on the concept of a no code MCP. But anyway, I've not seen one to your question, Maxime.
All right, good, good. It makes me feel a little bit better. But yeah, that's a great idea. It feels like a great April Fool's thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's create prompts that define your MCP that has direct access to your AWS instances.
Yeah.
What could go wrong, right?
Yeah. What is interesting, by the way, I wanted to mention, and I forgot to say it in the moment, what is interesting also though is that like one of the things though in an MCP type scenario is like, okay, so this MCP is relying on an LLM of some kind to interpret and process all the queries that it's getting, right? So what does become also interesting in that context is to know what kind of, let's say, like vulnerabilities or manipulation that LLM is like prompt is open to. That's been really interesting, by the way. That's been a real eye-opening experience. I don't know how many of you, I'll give a plug to a library called Garak, Garak. It's an open source library from NVIDIA for LLM testing. And it has categories of tests around trying to prompt misinformation, trying to prompt ethnic slurs, trying to like do jailbreaks of different types, and so on. And one of the things that so we bolted this into Firetail when we created an automation path around it for people who are using platforms like Amazon Bedrock. So Bedrock, it gives you, for those who haven't used it, this library of LLMs that you can pick from, providers, versions, models, different locations, et cetera, et cetera. But what we found is that like the variety, like the gaps between the tightest controlled and the most prone to manipulation is huge. And then the categories are unpredictable. So, like those that are open to jailbreak versus those that are open to content manipulation versus those that are open to like talk to me like I'm your grandmother, write a phishing email that goes around my ethics guardrails. Like it is so unpredictable and it is so different from anything that we expected. We went into it thinking like, oh, okay, like the bigger, more commercial ones, they're going to be more secure, right? So like Anthropic should be the best in class over here on Amazon Bedrock, and we'll go like maybe DeepSeek is going to be the loosest ethics guardrails, and there's some truth in it, but then all of a sudden like. Anthropic vulnerable to the grandma thing in particular, for instance, earlier versions pre 3.7 were pretty vulnerable to that. And DeepSeek, on the other hand, like certain things that you ask it, it straight up refuses. And it's quite surprising. But then you ask it a jailbreaky type thing, and it's like, no problem. I'm jailbroken. Now what? So it's just like extremely unpredictable. And I think, by the way, that's going to continue to be the case for like at least a year, if not more. There's such an arms race going on right now, and it's very much about like go fast, go fast, go fast. I just don't think there's a ton of security testing that goes into the models before they get shipped. Yeah, that's the link to it. By the way, I love the vibe of the chat. Just
Yeah, so even the big commercial ones, because I thought you were going to say, oh, this tiny developer somewhere random made a model and there's no guardrails. But even between commercial, that's interesting. But is it even a solvable? is it even a solvable problem? Is sort of like my core
It's
fear.
I it, I don't know the answer to that, and I think like probably not for a while at least. It's when you think about like what goes into a lot of these abuses, you have to really be able to map back to human intent, which is one of the hardest things to infer. One of the more interesting jailbreak techniques that we've seen is like combinations of either language plus base 64 or multilingual. There was something recently called the sandwich attack that got written up academically, and it's basically like I give 5 prompts in a row in 5 different languages with a base prompt that says, read all the prompts and execute what they say. Or sorry, read all the prompts in their language and execute what each of them says. And if you look at them in order, it's like French, tell me about the weather, the expected weather as a result of climate change. German, talk to me about something in history. Vietnamese, jailbreak this or write me a phishing email or whatever the case may be. Russian, something benign. Like you just go through 5 different languages, each with something, and somewhere in the middle you embed a malicious prompt. And apparently, this breaks the ability for the LLM to kind of understand or interpret your intentions. And so, like a lot of these types of techniques, it's going to be a while, I think, before the LLM model makers really say, like, no, 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 that's actually the most important thing for us to solve, as opposed to we need to solve more tokens, larger context window, generate images as well as text, video as well as images as well as text. Like, I just don't think security is the top priority for really any of them.
That's interesting. I wonder if the solution ends up being, fast forward a little while, and yes, we've gotten so much better at building in those guardrails that we can also do the compliance side of that, and to say, well, from this point on, we'll consider a model to be essentially the developer of the model is the legal guardian of that model, and if
Yeah,
if it does something, it goes back up to those people, which right now would be insanely scary. But I could see a world where like we're so good at it that if you left something over that puts you
yeah,
in trouble, like it's back
yeah.
up. Yeah.
To that point, I mean, somebody in the chat said a couple of breaches will solve it. I'm not sure, but I think what you said is maybe, a couple of lawsuits might. And, a couple lawsuits with regulation that has real teeth like GDPR, and then it becomes like really more meaningful. GDPR hasn't fixed things, but it certainly has improved the overall handling of privacy and data security for a lot of organizations. And, nowadays, the number of companies that I run into that if they have any kind of European consumer data exposure, they'll end up doing all their data handling by GDPR principles because it's so expensive to set it up once and to run all the processes around it. They just decide to make it the default for everything. So, which, by the way, kind of was the desired effect. If you can improve it based on like some regulatory framework based on a geography you're in, you have to do it everywhere. So,
Yeah, and it feels like it's it's an okay trade-off at this point, because the training of those foundational models is not something some person in their in the basement with one machine is going to be doing, right? So I think the
yeah,
argument of like, hey, all this compliance prevents innovation for the foundational models, like, does it really? I think OpenAI can afford to spend x millions on securing kind of the foundational models. So it's
yeah, yeah, for sure, for sure.
hmm. And how's the so kind of flipping back a little bit, full circle. So how's the state of API security? Do you see, is it still kind of an area that you're seeing a lot of new things happening and new efforts? Is there a specific type of efforts that you'd like to see in the future to help you do your job in a way, right?
Yeah, well, it's funny. New things almost never. Pretty much the same stuff time and again, and it's just, a question of finding new APIs that have the same vulnerabilities and running the exact same scripts and playbooks, etc. So not much new over there. I think like a lot of important vulnerable attack surfaces, APIs are being overlooked right now because of like, oh, there's this new shiny object. There's this AI thing that we have to go chase and figure out. And it's interesting, like the AI side of things, not to kind of like get off of the topic of the question that you asked, Maxi, but on the AI side, I will say like I'm having a very strong sense of deja vu to like 10, 12 years ago when I was really helping customers with cloud security. We're having the exact same set of conditions and circumstances where adoption has already happened. Security team's been completely out of the loop on all of the conversations about what are we going to do with AI. And so, like right now, there's a rush to capture visibility into what's happening and what's interesting about AI as opposed to like other technologies, like let's say cloud platforms. um, it comes in both a consumer flavor and a developer flavor. Like I can build an LLM powered application and an agent and an MCP and whatever, but I can also just talk to ChatGPT and upload, company files and things like that, right? And so it has a lot of the strong kind of things that we've experienced of the past of kind of shadow AI, of shadow IT, but it's happening like all across the organization, shadow IT. So not just in the past, like cloud was developers and infrastructure people. This is developers, infrastructure people, executives, senior executives, etc. And that's been really interesting. We're working on like we've taken our API technology and we've kind of adapted it over to this side, and we're able to now like get an organization a pretty good, not 100% complete, but a very good picture of the AI usage that's already happening in about 2 hours with the integrations that we have, which is like for a lot of organizations, that's the starting point, right? Establish visibility, and then you can start to lay out like your governance rules for how you want to be using this new technology. Yeah. And on that, by the way, we're coming up on time, right?
Yeah, but
Can I
I mean, go for it.
can I slip in one shameless plug for anybody who's going to be at Black Hat next week? Please come out and support us in the Startup Spotlight. We're top four finalists. We're going to be on stage pitching for the win. We're looking forward to it and love to have your support. And stop by and see us. We're at Startup City. I don't remember the booth number, but if you find Startup City, you will find us.
Awesome, awesome. Yeah, we'll drop by too. We'll be at that cat as well.
Awesome.
Thank you so much for coming in. That was very interesting. That was very interesting as usual.
Good deal.
If people want to get in touch with you, is there a better way to do that? Other
Yeah, I am not on any like Twittery type of platforms, but LinkedIn is definitely easy. But that's my email address. I just dropped into the chat. Just Jeremy at FireTail.ai is super easy to find. So yeah,
Awesome, awesome. Thanks. And yeah, we'll see everybody. I don't, I forget if we announce, are we doing Defender Fridays next week because of Black Hat?
Yep, we are.
I We are. Sweet.
Yep.
All
You
right.
guys,
Then
sweet.
excellent. Then we'll see you next week then. All right. Have a good weekend.